everybody, welcome back to This Is Not About Your Body. I'm your host, Jessie Nealand, and today I have a very exciting guest, somebody that I've been following for a really long time on social media, and I'm excited to bring on today. This is Jess Sprengle, who is a licensed eating disorder counselor, advocate, and educator who believes in joy and liberation for all people in all bodies. She specializes in treating eating disorders, but also happens to be a total meme queen on Instagram. So welcome, Jess.
Thank you for having me. Super excited to be here.
Yeah. So I'm just going to have you sort of get started with a little brief intro. So tell me about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Jess. I am a licensed therapist. I specialize in eating disorders, but because eating disorders often come with a ton of different things, I have come to also specialize in other stuff. A majority of the clients I see are LGBTQ, neurodivergent, and usually have some other diagnosis, whether it's like depression, anxiety, fill in the blank, and an eating disorder. I really love working with teens. I don't do that as much anymore, but I do just love working with adults, adolescents, the gamut. And I'm trying to think what else I do. More recently, I kind of have moved into consultation. So I'm doing a lot more education and consultation with other professionals. So that's like my big passion project right now. I really love teaching people, in part because the eating disorder field is, despite having a lot of professionals in it, is still really small as a niche. And a lot of people like outside of the eating disorder field don't have a whole lot of information about eating disorders. So my goal is to provide education and consultation to folks who want to learn more about eating disorders or just want to enhance their practice. So that has been,
that's cool.
Yeah, that has been awesome. I love the folks who have joined up and have been with me through it. It's new. I started it in July, so it's been a bit of a, I think anytime you start a new project, it's like, okay, is this going to work? How is this going to go? So I'm really, really grateful to the people who have been part of it, and they have really held on with me. So it's been awesome.
That is so cool.
Yeah. So that's me in a nutshell professionally. Those are the things I love to do and work with. I really love being a therapist. I really can't imagine doing anything else. I don't know what I would do if I had to do something else. I would be really sad, I think. I just love working with people.
Amazing. So, I mean, I think that the project you're talking about, the new project, is so cool because I also see a lot of like need for it. I love the idea that we could get some of the information, this incredibly crucial information, because eating disorders impact so many more people than anyone realizes, outside of the space of like, you signed up for a recovery program, therefore you have access to this information. So that's amazing. Yeah. I also wanted to go back. Sort of perhaps a strange question, but why do you think so many people with eating disorders are like also in another diagnosis camp, or showing up in LGBTQ, or showing up with neurodivergence?
Excellent question. Okay, how do I want to answer this? I think in very many ways, like an eating disorder it's not entirely behavioral, obviously. Like there's a lot of like a very significant thought process that fuels the behaviors. But oftentimes, if we think about it, like it is smoke and mirrors. Like a person is engaging with food and their body in such a way because of X reason. It might be because of a history of trauma, or it might be because of dysphoria, or it could be because we live in a very neurotypical world, and unfortunately it is not very accommodating to folks who are neurodivergent. So can be almost like an assimilation practice. So I mean, I think there are so many reasons why people have eating disorders, which is, I think something that we don't always understand as a culture. Like there isn't just one reason. There are a million, and hopefully one day we have more research and information about that. But in the meantime, I think we just see so much like co-occurrence. And I think for the most part, trauma fuels a lot of it. I wouldn't say that that is everybody's experience, because we never want to talk in absolute
Yeah.
when it comes to eating disorders, or anything. But I mean, I do think, trauma, even if it's just like what a person perceives as trauma, because that is what trauma is. It's like how a person's body reacts to an
Mhm.
event. And I think that that often is what fuels someone's development of an eating disorder, in addition to temperament, metabolism,
Yeah.
brain chemistry, fill in the
Yeah.
blank. It's a ton of different factors.
Yeah. Um, that is something that I obviously work a lot with in my coaching practice. Like we don't do the the actual in-depth anything, but we run into stuff, right? We run into trauma. I outsource. I work with a lot of people who also have therapy, specializing in eating disorder therapy or just regular therapy to support them as they sort of work through the other sort of co-occurring stuff. But a huge part of what I do, I think, is just really inviting people into the awareness that there is something else going on.
Yeah.
And I feel like even that is not a mainstream idea for eating disorders. Certainly not for body image issues.
No, and it is frustrating. I think the eating disorder field has grown. Even, I can think about my own experience and going through treatment as an adolescent, and some of the mainstream ideas in like the 2000 to 2010 area, really problematic. I don't know
Yeah.
that it's changed so significantly, but there was a lot more like shame-based treatment happening, and a lot more like, you're doing this, which first of all, even that language is really confusing. But
Yeah.
a lot of like, you're doing this to like harm other people,
Yeah. To get
or like,
attention. I feel like that was the big thing I heard a lot of back then.
right, or like, you need to really work on getting better for like the other people in your life.
Oh,
You're really
okay.
disruptive, which is like very much like, as an adolescent, I think I'm not surprised by that rhetoric, because
Yeah.
that's just like, I feel like adolescent treatment in general, not even just eating
Mm.
disorders. But I do think things have changed. Like, even, when I went through treatment, the concept of like recovered did not exist. That was like
Wow.
not, because I think that came out like 2011. I don't know. I'm just spitballing there, but
Yeah.
that was like just not a framework that had been presented to me. In fact, it was more of like, you will live with this for the rest of your life, and you
Yeah.
will just have to deal with it. And like, I don't know, at 17, that's not exactly the most like hopeful
Yeah.
thing. But yeah, I don't think there was a lot of like, there was certainly not good understanding around like how trauma contributes. I literally got like zero trauma education through my treatment,
Yeah.
which would have been helpful. But yeah, it was like just very focused on the behavioral aspects, which again makes sense in a higher level of
Yeah.
care if you're disrupting the symptoms, but not a whole lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember like friends and classmates and peers who would go through those kinds of experiences and how much it seemed to be like that they were almost being blamed for being so needy, like blamed for attention, being attention seeking. This was a really big one, which I also feel like I just wonder, like, would that still have come up if this were something that affected boys more than girls? Like, this perception of teenage girls being attention seeking, like for literally just needing help. I can't, I can't parse that apart from patriarchy and view of gender stuff. But yeah, just to hear that there wasn't even a concept for recovered. I didn't know that.
That's because Caroline Costin, I think identified the term, or like trademarked it, whatever the word we want to use
Oh,
there. And her book, in which I think she talks about that, which is 8 Keys. I have it in here somewhere. 8 Keys to Recovering from an Eating Disorder. I think that's what it's called. That was where she talked about it, and that did not come out until like early 2010s, I
got
think.
it. Yeah.
So yeah, so it is actually a newer concept within like the eating disorder field.
Yeah. So talk about recovered. What does it mean then?
So it's funny that I even bring it up, because I don't use it actually like because it's so not kind of embedded in my own experience, that I don't really, it doesn't resonate with me as
Yeah.
much. I just say like in long-term recovery for
Hmm.
myself. But The concept of recovered is basically like a person in long-term recovery who is like has not experienced symptoms in a really long time. It's mostly like maybe not necessarily like free of eating disorder thoughts necessarily, but like if they have a thought, it kind of moves along, and overall like a
Yeah.
healthy perspective and relationship with body and food, which is it's vague, I suppose, in a
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
because what does that mean? It's so different for every person, and I think that's also why I stopped using it, is because it's such like an inaccessible
Yeah.
term. No shade to it. Like if people want to use it, I really support that. And for myself, I was like, this just doesn't. It feels like very final, and I
Yeah.
don't think that I don't think that really any person who struggles with any sort of mental health or mental illness is ever like at an end point.
Yeah.
I will process through and grow through my own mental health stuff probably forever, and I'm
Hmm.
cool with that. Like I think, challenge accepted.
Yeah.
That's how I view it, which is I think also why I don't use that term. And also, again, I think just from like a privileged place, it's of course like, thinking about my own privilege, like I had access to so many resources. So of course, like I have access to recovered versus like a lot of folks do not
Yeah.
have that.
Yeah.
So
I could imagine it being kind of like body positivity sort of messaging around like loving your body as sort of unconditionally and forever. It ultimately, it absolutely helps some people, and I totally support that if it does, but I also see it do more harm than good for a lot of folks because it ends up feeling like an unrealistic, impossible goal.
yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the criticisms have kind of moved, where it's like this is just like another arbitrary slash like
Hmm.
impossible goal for folks to work towards. And
Yeah.
you know, people with eating disorders, myself included, really again love a challenge, and well, I think that can unfortunately like become almost like part of eating disorder symptomatology, where it's like, oh yes, like I'm going
Yeah.
to work really hard towards this thing, which is a recovery thing, but I'm going to work towards it
Yeah.
in an eating disorder way. So it's almost like counterintuitive.
It makes so much sense though. Um, so the way that I will often approach with clients around body image stuff is the idea of like relating to those thoughts and feelings differently. And I'm guessing it's sort of similar, that long-term recovery doesn't mean those thoughts and feelings don't show up. It means you feel really, really well resourced when they do, or you have a relationship with
Yes.
them that is entirely different. So talk a little bit about someone who is going to continuously see like those things show up in their long-term recovery, and how that, like, sort of best case scenario, how that actually looks,
It's a
or
really
not
good
best case,
question.
but you know.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
well, we want to think best case.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my own personal experience and in my experience with clients, like what this really looks like is, because I think unfortunately too, like with eating disorder thoughts, there's this like once people are able to identify them and see them in real time, there's a lot of shame where it's like, why do I
Mm,
have these thoughts? Like, why is this still
yeah.
happening? Like, why am I still experiencing this? And a lot of it is just having compassion for yourself and compassion for the fact that like, oh, your brain just does this. This is not like
Yeah.
some, insidious process that you're causing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like once like a pathway is formed in your brain and that's like been an activated pathway, it's going to
Yeah.
continue to be activated. It's not going to like just die, unfortunately. So during times of stress, that might absolutely
Yep.
pop up more. So a lot of it is like education and trying to help folks recognize like, oh, this is just like brain garbage sometimes. um Usually I'll call it like brain indigestion
Oh,
or
I
brain
like that.
garbage, where it's like, similarly, like sometimes your body just like creates things it doesn't need, or like it
Yeah.
takes in things that it like can't really process, or and it's just like but it's just there. You can't
Yeah.
necessarily just like get rid of it.
Yeah.
Um, it's a matter though of just identifying it that way and recognizing like, oh, I don't have to lean into this, or like I don't
Yeah.
actually have to like engage with the garbage. And I think like using it fun words or kind of like
Uh-huh.
creating some sort of metaphor helps. Folks do well with that.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think that like I have certainly seen, I worked with adolescents a lot earlier in my career, and it was always so cool to watch people grow up and
Oh.
really like and I think sometimes as people grow up, like their life expands
Yeah.
and they can see life beyond their eating disorder. Does that happen always? Obviously not, but I feel really lucky that I was able to see that in a number of cases. And it really, what it looked like was people engaging more in their lives and seeing like, oh, I can go to college if and I can have these thoughts, but I can still go to college.
Yep.
So I think like having a dangling carrot too is always nice, like
Yeah.
something you're kind of working towards. But I think in real life, what that looks like is like you can kind of wake up and be like, ugh, I feel X today in my body, and just be like, okay, and next we're going
Yeah.
and doing whatever. It's like, feeling certain types of ways or like having certain thoughts, but still doesn't really stop the flow of your life.
Yeah, totally. I really, really love brain indigestion. I think because it's so easily parallel to like if you didn't know that indigestion was a thing that happens and is perfectly safe, even though it's a little uncomfortable, you might think you were having a heart attack, right? Like if someone
Right.
thought that sort of feeling, like you could easily spiral out of control over it, or you could just go, well, this is annoying, and move on with your day. And it really feels to me like a lot of what you are talking about is getting people to the place that they can say this is annoying and move on with their day. It cuts the whole thing down in size and power.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what they need, right? Like because we can't just stop stuff. We can't just be like, no more thinking this thought anymore. No more having indigestion. You have to be able to relate with it in a way that it doesn't screw your life up.
Yeah. And I do a lot of parts work, which like probably beyond the scope of this, but it's
Mm,
essentially like, oh, we're all comprised of different parts, and they're usually parts of ourselves are usually well-meaning.
yeah.
So I try also to conceptualize it as like, okay, well, this part of yourself is really trying hard to protect you. Like
Yeah.
like, this part of you, the eating disorder part of you, is really driving the bus right now. So
Mm-hmm.
like, what are we driving the bus away from?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on? So really trying to help people understand like there's usually a function to this. Eating disorders don't
Yeah.
just exist for like funsies.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone's like having a great time. So really reminding people like you have found this incredible way to survive and adapt, and
Yeah.
but it's not working quite the same way anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and that's okay. But what was it doing for you? And
Yeah.
find something else that will maybe provide a similar comfort, but
Yeah.
without all of the destruction.
Yeah. Amazing. I did want to just ask, because I read on your website and I really, really liked this, that you particularly enjoy working with quote unquote difficult clients. Like I forget how you put it, but people who are sort of labeled in this way as like being difficult or being too much or being, whatever. And I wanted to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's so funny. What I think where that stemmed from was in the just general mental health field. There's a lot of conversation around like who is your ideal client, and I have so much problem. Like I take so much issue with that, which is probably just my own shit. Like it's just semantics, and I'm nitpicky. But I mean, the clients I work with are never anyone's ideal clients, unfortunately. And I can say
Mm,
that as someone I have never been an ideal client because of all of
mm,
my shit. And unfortunately, like there's just this way in which people are labeled depending on diagnosis. Like I worked a lot with folks with borderline personality when I was in my internship, and I that diagnosis in particular is so demonized in our field. Also very women centric, which is a big surprise.
mm-hmm.
Um, but it really taught me a lot about how there is just no empathy for certain diagnoses, and in
Yeah.
fact, like there's like the opposite of empathy, and
Yeah.
oftentimes like this labeling is like you're difficult, you're resistant, and people internalize that. I mean, I've had so many clients ask me outright, like, "Do you want to keep working with me? Am I too difficult?" And it just
Oh,
it like cracks me open because
yeah.
like, yes, I want to work, like everybody is difficult in a particular way. Like none of
Mm-hmm.
us are without I don't know, resistance and flaws. And I
Yeah.
a lot of the people I work with in our field are people who are labeled as difficult. I think just generally people with eating disorders are labeled as difficult.
Yeah.
Oh, such a resistant illness or whatever. And I'm like, shut up. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want to hear your nonsense.
Do you think
But
that's just because people see it as like, it's like a choice and they should just choose differently? Is that basically where that comes from?
yeah, I've heard different things. I think someone who's like really and truly not educated around it would say something like that. Um, in very much the same way that I think people look at like substance use issues as a choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think more often what I hear is that there's just a lot of difficulty like holding the ambivalence that is seen in eating disorders, where it's like can't really sit with the medical piece, where it's like someone's physiology is threatened on a daily basis, but they're not necessarily gung-ho about choosing recovery. Which that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I think the medical piece is really challenging for providers to sit with.
Yeah.
And that I think makes it difficult. Yeah.
So something that I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember reading that eating disorders were the most lethal of all mental health diagnoses. Yeah.
I think it's
right?
like I don't know if it's since changed, but I know that in 2021 it was surpassed by opioid use disorder.
Oh, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this would have been a couple of years ago.
Which makes sense, like given the pandemic. But yes, I mean, otherwise, eating disorders are one of like the most fatal psychiatric illness versus substance use issues.
Yeah.
Which totally makes sense. But I think like the statistic is someone dies of an eating disorder or like related like complications of an eating disorder like every hour.
Wow.
Which is terrible.
It is terrible, but it's also something that I think it sort of like blows my mind when I think about it too much. I get really like, I don't know, it's a dark headspace to try to occupy that. We have diet culture pushing this whole idea that, obviously there's a lot of misinformation and manipulation there, but essentially the idea is that it would be healthier, right? Like that they're trying to give you something that would be healthier than whatever it is you're already doing. And on the other side of that, we know that diet culture influences eating disorders, and eating disorders are just killing people. So like, what in the hell do people think they're doing? Like, why is this an acceptable? I mean, I recognize, oh my God, it's complicated. I know there's layers, but it's so upsetting just to see how easily people are comfortable pushing diets and just don't seem to care in the slightest on the other side, that being underweight, being malnourished, being, it's so dangerous and unhealthy.
Yeah. I mean, I also have to like kind of train myself out of not going into that space because it's really easy to, I think in the eating disorder field in particular, it is so easy to get burnt out. It is so easy to like really fall into this place of despair because, you work with people who like by and large don't get better.
Yeah.
Granted, I feel very fortunate. I have walked with a lot of people through their journeys and they have gotten better and just, live a life that they identify as worth living. And still like there are plenty of people who don't. And I think that is really hard to hold and hard to sit with, especially when we know that there are so many ways in which like this could be remedied. There's so many, there are so many resources for people who want to go on a diet, but there are so few resources in comparison for folks who are dealing with an eating disorder. Similarly, like people around them, like, I think that's where there's a lot, like a huge deficit in resources is like people in, there's community is a huge deficit, I think, for folks in recovery. Whereas like, I don't know, like there's community everywhere. If you're on it, it's like you just can talk about it literally anywhere you are.
Oh, that's so true.
So infuriating. But I mean, and I think unfortunately diet culture has also influenced who we identify as having an eating disorder and like what different bodies should get in terms of treatment, which I think is also bogus. I
So
think
that's actually one of the questions I have written down. So
ah,
talk a little bit about that. What do you mean?
I think largely I would say yes, it is influenced by diet culture, because I don't know like that we would have this issue if not for kind of that component. But I think, a lot of the time, if I offer a training, usually if it's like a one-on-one, I ask the like people who are attending, like, what do you think of when, like, what comes to mind when you hear eating disorder? Almost always I get like, thin, cis, white, female adolescent.
Yep.
Who comes from money. Like, pretty much always. Like,
Totally.
I get some variation of those, which is, unfortunately, I think that is the stereotype for a reason, because that is like what we see most represented in media. It is what we see most represented in case studies, things like that. So like if you pull up research, like that is like largely what is studied.
Yeah.
But I think we have finally done a little bit more research and found that good majority of folks who struggle with eating disorders are like of quote unquote normal weight or in the quote unquote overweight category. Say like in quotations, because those categories are arbitrary and don't really mean anything.
Yeah.
But like most people, even with anorexia, do not look quote unquote look like what we envision anorexia looks like. And you can really have anorexia at any weight, because the concept of underweight is, we as a culture view it as like, oh, well, you're in this BMI category, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, it's like you are under the weight that is healthy and ideal for your body. So it's so individual.
Yeah.
But
so having been a personal trainer and worked really hard to keep my own body, in a very particular space, I can look back and say I was underweight for years. I was even technically, I think I was heavy enough to stay out of the underweight category for the most part, because I was like training. So I had a lot of muscle. But undoubtedly I was in a space that was not like healthy or sustainable. And I can just see that and be like, not one single person, not one time in all of those years ever expressed concern for me and my health. And I mean, that's just not how it's seen, right? It's not seen as a problem until you're literally like hooked up in a hospital on a ventilator because you're like, your organs started shutting down.
Yeah.
Then you've gone too far.
Yeah. It is. It's really infuriating. And I can pull from my own experiences and the experiences of clients where it's like, it is interesting to see how you were treated, even in like treatment spaces, based on how you look. Because I know for myself, like having cycled through treatment several times, I was treated very differently, depending on where I was, diagnoses wise or weight wise, which diagnoses is a whole different soapbox I get on. But I mean, I think it is really, really problematic. And I think it's especially harmful because it's problematic in the system. Like, it's basically like the call is coming from inside the house. Like, I think eating disorder treatment, unfortunately, has taken a really long time to catch up to, all people of all sizes can have eating disorders. We need to be thoughtful about our messaging, and also like thoughtful about how we, provide nutrition across the board. Also like even thinking about like furniture, how do we like decorate our spaces, and is it accommodating to folks of different sizes? Oftentimes no. So it's really curious that a lot of the eating disorder treatment system actually perpetuates the fat phobia that we see kind of culturally around eating disorders. It's not great. Seems like there's some work being done around it, but it's slow going.
Yeah. So something that I see being so damaging, unfortunately, is people who don't feel like they qualify because of this messaging. People who have basically any body other than that stereotype you just sort of like drew upon. They will often say to me like, well, I'm weird about food, but it's not like I have an eating disorder or anything. If you looked at me, you'd understand why or something. And I'm like, we have really come to think of it as almost like there's one symptom and the symptom is visual. And there's nothing else. And therefore representation of fat bodies, representation of trans bodies, representation of, Black and Indigenous and people of color. Like we are just not, it's like they don't even feel permission to identify that they have a problem because it's not quote unquote bad enough, which I realize is sort of its own whole thing too.
Right. Well, and I think too, there's clinician bias or like a lack of competence so far as like identifying folks in the like in marginalized populations who might struggle with eating disorders. That's its own huge problem.
Yeah.
Because most eating disorder professionals are not competent in terms of like just working with folks outside of a very small window.
Yeah.
Like even, I think it's interesting to me that there aren't more like LGBTQ affirming providers in the eating disorder space, because it feels very obvious to me. Like this is not that like I think it is a very specialized type of approach, but it's not so specialized that like you should not just be doing this.
Right.
So I feel very frustrated around that, just because it's like so many people who are queer and trans have eating disorders, and often they are not clocked because I think it is very accepted. Like I think in queer spaces, it's like, oh yeah, like that's just the thing. And especially I think for trans folks, like just from like, because I think there's this expectation that with eating disorders, it's like dysmorphia, but I think dysphoria is also a very big part of eating disorders as well. It's really just if you have discomfort in your body and you're soothing that through using eating disorder symptoms, okay, like that's still an eating disorder. It doesn't really necessarily matter what's like provoking it.
Totally. So this being something that I almost feel like, I don't know how quite to put it, but there is a concern or sort of a pattern I see come up where clients will say something to the effect of like feeling like failures because they didn't eating disorder properly. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're like, I'm out here suffering because I think about food all the time and whatever, but I still am not thin enough. Like it's like I've failed at having the right kind of eating disorder or something.
I'm not good at having an eating disorder.
Yes, I'm not good at having an eating disorder. That's exactly it. And that is such a backwards little thing to have to navigate.
I cannot tell you how often I hear that. If I had a nickel, be very rich. It breaks my brain.
Like there's no other diagnosis that we do this with, right? Like, I'm not depressed enough. Like I'm not anxious enough. Like nobody else.
I mean, I think we could probably see parallels in like the substance use world. Like that there's like a hierarchy in terms of, I think sometimes like folks who have used opioids are like viewed as like, I don't know, like it's not like the same thing, but it's like, oh, like these are people who have suffered the most.
Yeah, like they almost like deserve the label.
Right. Like, oh, like they get the best treatment or they should get the best treatment.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I don't think it is not quite the same.
Right. Because they're not like celebrated the way thin people are.
No. And I think it's so interesting that piece about like, I'm bad at having an eating disorder. I cannot tell you, like, I've heard that so much that it's like, how is this such a universal symptom? Like, I feel like this needs to be like talked about and embedded in the, like how we conceptualize this illness, because so much of it, I think at this point has been informed by our treatment system, where it's like, and insurance companies, where it's like, oh, well, my insurance company cut me from treatment. I don't know why it keeps like the
that's okay.
camera keeps like zooming out. The insurance systems that, especially in the United States, I'm not entirely sure how it goes in other countries. I have heard that with Canada, it's not quite the same. But essentially, like here, you, our healthcare system is an interesting one. But essentially, you can go to eating disorder treatment. You can like quote unquote qualify, and you have to qualify. And once you get there, if they like, if you gain X amount of weight and they decide that you are no longer, you should no longer be getting this level of care, they can just cut you and you will have to go home. And that, I think that very much has informed how eating disorders show up, because people have really internalized that to mean like, unless I am like in a place where I can be in treatment for X amount of time, I'm definitely not sick enough. And it's, I mean, obviously our whole healthcare system really needs a revamp.
Yeah.
That in particular, especially because, granted, I don't think that substance use is well covered either, but I think there is a lot better coverage for a lot of with a lot of insurance plans around substance use. Like they will at least
Yeah.
give you like 30 days, I think, in a facility. Might not always be like the most ideal treatment, but you at least get
Yeah.
30 days. Whereas eating disorders, like, okay, maybe you'll have like a week.
Wow.
So it's disappointing, to say the least.
Yeah.
And this isn't new. Like if this was going on like when I was a teenager, which is
Yeah.
long enough ago. But like, okay, what are we doing to change this? There's just not there's not a lot of movement.
Yeah. So it sends the message like basically that you are not deserving of care until you are very, very sick, which I feel like is really very telling in this particular kind of space, and also reflected, like you said, in how people say I'm not sick enough or I'm not good at this, or whatever it is. But there's also something about that I guess it just feels like, oh, I've lost my train of thought. God damn it. Well, if it comes back, I'll share it. But there's something about that like is just mind blowing. And it trips me out to think about the fact that someone could enter care. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is like, until very recently, the diagnoses were around weight loss, right? Like, or you had to have lost a percentage of your body weight in order to qualify. And then once you've gained that percentage back, congratulations, you're healed, right? Like they can just watch you eat or make you eat and send you home. And they have done absolutely nothing to address the actual underlying issue, because the weight change is a symptom and not even a guaranteed symptom. Right. It's just a possible symptom. And they've just like made you now feel that if you go home and continue to suffer, you are invalid, you are crazy, you are bad or wrong. Now you're making it up. Like there's just the messages that this stuff sends to people. So damaging.
And I can't think of anything more like insidious and just ugly than like really like having a treatment system set up that communicates essentially, like it reinforces existing like cognitive distortions that a person is already experiencing. Like, so, so many people with eating disorders have issues with self-worth, or have issues with believing they are deserving of anything, let alone care. That's so much of the disorder is like, I don't deserve love. I don't deserve food.
Attention.
I don't fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And so to enter a system in which you are being told, roll of the dice, you may get told on any given day that like, oh, actually, you don't deserve this care anymore.
Oh, yes.
It just reinforces it, and it makes it worse. I don't think that's necessarily helpful. And then, of course, people cycle through treatment a lot, and then they are blamed for being resistant or chronic.
Right.
And our system has set that up. So it's really, it feels dystopian, honestly, but I do think we don't well, and of course, as a field, we don't want to admit the harm that we've done, but I do think that we have contributed really significantly to the endurance of these illnesses, and also just their ongoing development. So we have I don't know, the mental health field has a lot to pay for, kind of over just for a lot of illnesses, but I think eating disorders for sure.
It's like really refreshing to hear that, though. I mean, one of the reasons obviously I wanted to have you on is I felt like pretty aligned, in terms of sort of viewing this through a lens of liberation, and like really just in a way that makes freaking sense to me, like getting to the root of the thing, not just writing it off and not contributing to ideas such as like, if you're fat, how could you possibly have an eating disorder? You don't count, which unfortunately is so common in other spaces. Not necessarily explicitly stated like I just stated it, but the message is there anyway. But yeah, it's uncomfortable to hear someone in your field say it. It's also refreshing to hear someone in your field say it, like, yes, oh God.
It's horrible. And I think like accessing this space, like kind of where I do genuinely believe these things. And not I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Like I'm not trying to create problems. And I know that there have been very many ways in which, like, if you exist in the mental health field as it currently stands, you are causing harm. I recognize that. And there are ways in which I help. And I have to find some balance there. And I have to at least name the ways in which I probably perpetuate harm, and also just the way our field in general perpetuates harm. And honestly, I think like recognizing that has even helped with my own recovery. I think like just acknowledging like this system is fucked, and just the way in which we conceptualize eating disorders, the way in which we conceptualize treatment, it's not like it's oftentimes like not on the nose. And so it's given me, I don't know, like I think it gave me a lot of opportunities for unlearning. As an adult, I think I've been able to really unlearn a lot of the nonsense that I learned from treatment as a teen. And it's really just, I feel like I've been able to have a lot more compassion for myself. And through that, of course, I can have a lot more compassion for my clients who have very much similar struggles.
Well, it's also something I think we sort of see like the psychiatric field, like the medical field. We're like, oh, it's science, it must be true. So if it feels really, really objective, even when it's not, right? Like being gay was considered a mental illness like not that long ago. And there's still so many issues in this space. So for someone to be like, well, this is about weight, you're cured, like you feel like, oh, well, they're a freaking medical authority. Like they know that what they're talking about. So clearly it's me who's wrong. There's not a lot of talk about the fact that this is new and evolving and constantly making mistakes and constantly going back in and rewriting like definitions of things. So I feel like having gone through what you're talking about, really learning this stuff, it makes you go, oh, okay. So now I can actually like trust myself. I can empower them to trust themselves. Diagnoses, et cetera, can be in the ether around us rather than centering it on like, it's this or it's nothing.
Right. And I certainly see a lot of, and I think just this is the nature of the thing. A lot of people with eating disorders are very fixated on rigidity and like hard and fast things. So I have a lot of people who are like, well, this is what the diagnosis says. So I need to have all of these checked off. And I love just educating people on the DSM and being like, actually, like, no. And in part, I think the DSM has evolved over time to fit the like medical industrial complex. Like it is very much has been created and written to really in such a way that it is like billable by insurance, essentially, which is really unfortunate. But that's the reality. Like if you even the eating disorder diagnoses are so behavioral in the DSM, and like we know that there's so much about eating disorders that is not behavioral, and that is not listed at all. There's like hardly any,
just because they can't.
Right, because you can't qualify that. You can't quantify it and measure it. So like the anorexia nervosa diagnosis has a BMI criterion, which it was like
it does
when they were creating the DSM-5, I believe that it was pushed for it to not be in there because it's like, what are we doing? Like that is not actually helpful. But of course it made it through, in part because that helps. Again, maybe this is me being a conspiracy theorist, but it's like this, I think honestly, it allows insurance companies to deny people because it's like very specific criteria. It's like mild, moderate, and severe. And then it has the BMI listed. I'm like, there is no eating disorder in the world that is mild. Like,
right. Oh my gosh, that's so true that it would break it down in these sort of arbitrary ways, just not in any way actually honoring the human experience. Just for listeners, can you tell us what the DSM-5 is, please?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I think that it's so funny, when you like say something so many times that like you kind of forget what it even stands for. Essentially, it's like the big book of mental health diagnoses. It's like our Bible, essentially.
And it just got rewritten recently or re-updated or whatever, right?
Yeah, they
was it go?
revised it, I think, in 2021 or
Mm-hmm.
2020. But it was like only a few things changed. It
Mm.
wasn't like a whole rewrite. DSM-5 came out in 2013. I was like in grad school when it changed, which that was really interesting. Having to learn two different books, but
Oh, weird.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it really had a revamp. Like
Got it.
they changed so many things from DSM-4 to DSM-5. So
Mm.
not great.
Wow. Yeah, my dad was a therapist, and I remember reading through his when I was growing up, and just like reading all of the definitions of things and being like so fascinated by all of these things. And again, I think at that time it was like all things queer were sort of diagnosable as mental illness, and yeah, there's just a lot about it that has changed since then. It feels so like primitive to look back on almost.
It's, I don't know, it's funny. Like I because I can say the same, like I'm thinking even like in undergrad, I think I took like a psychopathology course, or back then referred to as like abnormal psychology, which that's great. That's good.
Right. That's oh
So many
man.
problems right there. And I think for some of it we had to read through like the DSM, and I remember being like so fascinated, and of course, like I think if you are someone who has had any sort of mental health issue, reading some of this stuff, it is validating. And
Yeah, sure.
but at the same time, sometimes it can be like very othering,
Yeah.
because it's like, oh shit, like I check these boxes. I am in this book. That is not good.
Yeah. I remember because I was like young, I would read through and I'd be like, okay, I have all of these. Like I have a symptom of everything, right? Like OCD, I would like convince myself like, yes, I have OCD because sometimes I like to arrange things and I like the order, I like the whatever. And there were definitely things. And I actually feel like that's kind of a valuable lesson to have now is like we all can check boxes in all of these diagnoses. Like
Yep.
that is just part of the human experience being put into boxes and like categories and whatever. So we can hopefully help people, but like it's really just variations on humanness.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was a really helpful lesson actually in terms of borderline personality disorder. Like
Mm,
learning for myself, and this I believe like when I was at my internship, we had talked about this, where it's like at some point or another, everyone can have symptoms of borderline personality
sure.
disorder.
Yeah.
Like every teenager, really.
Yeah.
Just very like explosive
Yeah.
emotions or chaotic
Reactive.
relationships. There's so many ways in which people could qualify for that
Sure.
diagnosis and not actually have it. But we often see it as like this very other thing, which is like, oh God, like that person has that. And I can't relate to that at all. But it's like,
Yeah.
we all can, I
Yeah.
think there are so many diagnoses like that where it's like, oh, okay, like I can have empathy for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that taught me just a lot about that particular diagnosis, because again, learning in like formal training about borderline, you don't learn anything nice, and you don't learn
Mm,
anything good. So being exposed to a very different model was really, really helpful, where it was like, oh,
wow.
actually, like,
Yeah.
we're not so different from our clients. It's just for them, it has become really disruptive to their life. Whereas,
Right.
maybe for others, it's like, this was disruptive to my life for like a minute, and now it's not.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, so actually, that kind of leads into a question I wanted to ask you, which is like the difference between someone with disordered eating and someone with an eating disorder. Can you just talk a little bit about like how you see that? And obviously, like anything that you think would be helpful to listeners, because I'm not even sure quite what to ask about it.
I get this question a lot, actually. Like, what is the difference between an eating disorder and disordered eating? And I feel like it is a little challenging to answer because it is
Yeah.
so similar. And like, even if you look it up, it does not, it's like there are no significant differences necessarily. The way that I teach it usually is like there is a gap between like disordered eating and a full-blown eating disorder, and that gap is mental health, where it's essentially like someone
Mm,
who is like a disordered eater and they kind of stay in that category. Like they have certain alarm bells that might go off if they like stray too far into like really, really dangerous behavior, or more like very full-blown eating disorder behavior. Whereas interestingly, I think folks who like will develop an eating disorder or do have one, like their alarm system doesn't work. It's like,
Ooh, interesting.
yeah, so it's like you're doing things that are in complete opposition to what your body needs or wants, and the alarm bell is just like not going off.
Okay.
I think though, because from what we know with research, like I think it's like something like 25 to 35% of folks who engage in disordered eating will develop a full-blown eating disorder. So I think you can maybe wear that system down. If we're kind of using that metaphor, where it's like someone with disordered eating over time could potentially like surpass the alarms, which then I think is eating disorder territory. I think a lot of like the quote unquote symptoms are the same, but they look different.
Okay, so there was a freeze and we're just going to go back. Technical difficulties. So you were telling me about the difference between disordered eating and eating disorders. And I found it so fascinating. I'd love to finish that up.
Okay. Yeah. Because I think I was saying like both can be pretty disruptive to a person's life, but in different ways. Like, I guess if we think about it, like someone who is engaging in disordered eating, but they have a lot of people in their life who are doing the same things, they're going to have comrades in that. Like, you can all go to a restaurant and be ordering a ton of the same stuff with a bunch of modifications. Whereas like, I feel like it's a little less common for, say, like someone with an eating disorder to like be around people who are doing the same stuff that they are.
That's an interesting difference. Just the idea that one has like enough commonalities that it can feel like you're in it together versus one is very isolating because you've sort of gone off the rails of normal disordered eating into like weirder behaviors that make someone feel really isolated. Not weirder, but less common.
Although at the same time, I think there are people who are engaged in disordered eating to such a degree where people are sort of side-eyeing them, like, what the fuck is
sure.
this? But yeah, I do think like disordered eating is a little bit more quote unquote it's like eating disorder light or something. Which, God, that's a horrible thing to say, but it's almost like, oh, people can see this and accept it as like, oh, this is just what people do to stay healthy or stay thin, versus like, someone with an eating disorder, it's like, oh God, like that is too much. And it's like, they're not that far from each other.
Right.
And we pathologize one and celebrate the other. So like, maybe we should look at that.
Yeah, definitely. And something that I think is really interesting that you said about that gap between them being mental health is just thinking too, like someone, like one person with their brain chemistry and their life experience and everything, they might be able to stay in a space of disordered eating forever without developing anything beyond that. And someone else just simply can't, right? Like they start down the spiral, it spirals, it just goes. And it's now in full-blown eating disorder land. And because of those things that are sort of intangible, we don't exactly know why one person can and why one person can't, or at one point in their life they could, and then it stopped working or whatever, right? That just to sort of be aware of like one is almost like a contained version of the other. And that so many not that it's exactly contained, but so many factors way beyond our awareness or control determine the difference.
Right.
So the fact that one would be celebrated and one would be pathologized, like, is just bonkers.
And the whole thing is kind of bonkers.
The whole thing is bonkers.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, I think there are so many things too that like might keep someone in like disordered eating or dieting, which those could be interchangeable. Versus an eating disorder. Like there's just so many, like so much we don't know and may never understand. But I think it was in 2019 they did a study, like it was a really big study that identified that there's like a metabolic origin potentially to eating disorders, which like, okay, like that might explain why someone shifts into an eating disorder versus like kind of staying in disordered eating. And I just want to say, like, I know we're talking about it in terms of like that one is like worse than the other, but I know that folks who experience disordered eating are also suffering.
Oh
uh,
yeah.
and definitely don't want to minimize that, because that also is miserable. It's really just miserable either way.
It's all miserable, but I do think it's so interesting just that we have these categories and that we see
Yeah.
these particular categories as so different. And I suppose probably substance abuse is a similar place. It's like celebrated to be a party person. It's, sort of looked
Right.
down upon to be an addict. So somewhere in between these two things, which are not necessarily so different, except they also are,
Right.
is yeah.
Well, it's about the environment.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so before we finish up, I did just want to ask, in your practice, what do you see as the sort of like relationship between eating disorder and body image issues?
It's a good question. Um,
Because I think a lot of people assume that they go hand in hand, but I actually feel like they're pretty separate. Like certainly they coexist a lot, but I'm curious how you see it coming from the other side.
I do think that for a large majority of people with eating disorders, that body image is a huge component, to the point of like being a deterrent in their recovery process a lot of the
Yeah,
time, just because your body is potentially changing and that's really difficult to tolerate. Um, I mean, I will say that there are certainly some people I've worked with who their body image stuff is so profoundly worse than other people,
hmm,
that it's almost like, like what
yeah,
is that about? But oftentimes it can be really challenging to actually work on the body image stuff because they are so compromised
mm,
physiologically, that it's like, putting out this fire here is like kind of missing the wildfire in the background.
yeah,
Um,
totally,
so it, do I do think that because a like common underlying mechanism for eating disorders is like overvaluation of weight and shape. And that's like kind of a pretty
yeah,
core commonality across many eating disorders, not the only one. But that I think is more or less like a fundamental piece of things, even though it's
yeah,
like obviously it's about other stuff. It's not
yeah,
necessarily like the only thing, but I do think it is a component that, I don't know, it's a pretty big one.
yeah,
And yeah, I can't say I have seen very many people with eating disorders at this point in my career who have not struggled really significantly with body image stuff in
yeah,
one way or another throughout
makes sense.
their experience.
So what's interesting in my practice is I get a lot of people who have essentially gone through recovery. They have
Yeah.
gotten their eating behaviors, whatever, under control, or they actually feel like they're pretty damn recovered, and they still have such lingering, substantial body image issues that they're like, okay, well, there was no time or space to deal with that in recovery. So now
Yep.
is the time to deal with it. So I actually work with a lot of people with body image issues who used to have both, but now only have, because it's like a
So
triage
funny.
situation, right? Like not eating
Yeah.
could kill you. So fix that first, deal with that. Like obviously they're related,
Right.
but that is the, sort of glaring alarm bell. And then there comes a point where they're like, yeah, but what the hell? I still feel these ways, or I still have these thoughts, or I still have these things. And so that's kind of the space that a lot of my clients come in. And
That,
it's
yeah.
fascinating to sort of see. I mean, obviously some people, never had anything in the space of disordered eating as well. You can just have
Right.
body image issues, but like it is an interesting space.
I'm not surprised by that, honestly, like at all.
Yeah.
Because I think there is this like, I don't even know how to conceptualize it, but there is this belief, I think, that, oh, well, if you are fully nourished and you like go through your recovery process and you like mostly like level things out, the body image stuff will just go away. I
Right.
swear I have heard that,
Yeah.
my own treatment and from others. And it's like, that is not how it works. Like
No, I
you still have to live in the world.
yeah.
And all of the things that created your eating disorder didn't go away. Like you're
Right.
still you. And there are ways in which you're going to have to really like come nose to nose with why you're you,
Mhm.
or like the things that make you you. And some of those might not be things you like. And
Yeah.
I think like it has to channel somewhere. So of course it's going to potentially come out through
Yeah.
body image or self-worth, etc. But
I
yeah, I'm not
sometimes
surprised by that.
Yeah, I sometimes think of it as like the the shift from focusing on appearance to focusing like on performance in the gym, the time that I was working out, there was a very, very big push in my world to be like, get strong, not skinny, you know?
Right.
And I bought in, and I was like, well, this will cure me of all of my insecurities. How wonderful. And then when I got injured, I discovered like, oh, son of a bitch. Like I had just put all those same habits and patterns and insecurities. I just scooted them over to the next category. And I was like, is this category better than the first one? Yeah, sure. Because it's not quite as like societally pressured
Right.
as it is to be strong. But I just basically scooted it from aesthetics to performance and was still completely on the other side of it. Was like, well, I still don't like myself though. Like there's still stuff here that is just getting in the same exact way. So I wonder sometimes if it's like somebody who goes through that recovery, if they're kind of in the same boat where it just gets scooted over to like the slightly better option, and then they get to heal the slightly better option, and then we just keep scooting it along.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's like, okay, well, you're not dying anymore.
Yeah, I'm safe.
So like, that's nice. Great. Awesome. Okay, go about your life now. Like, go on.
Yeah.
It is. I think the body image piece though, like not being resolved, it's why people relapse. And I think like even well down the line, it's why people relapse. Because it's just hasn't been like remedied. And that's unfortunate. So again, I think lots of issues within the eating disorder field. That is arguably one of them. But I do think that there is more push for like, okay, you can do body image work, not necessarily in the very like critical stages, but like when someone is, moving along a little bit and gaining traction, like, okay, we can talk about this and hope that the person can tolerate it. Because I think even just talking about it makes a difference.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thank you so much for being on here. This was great. I have so many questions I didn't even get to because the work that you do is so interesting to me. I would invite you to share, if you want people to find you, where can they look you up?
Sure. I'm on Instagram at the Cranky Therapist. And on Twitter, I am Jess Sprengle LPC. But if you just type in the Cranky Therapist, you'll find me on there as well. And I think that's it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And to everybody listening, thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Instagram as well at Jessie Nealand, and you can find my website at jessienealand.com. Shoot me a message, shoot me an email, however you want to reach out is great. And I'll catch you next episode.